Alex, welcome to the Leap podcast. Thank you so much for being on with us today. It's great to have you here. For those of us who don't know Alex and MyEmpire, we're going to dig into a little bit of the background. We're going to talk about where you've come from and what led you to where you are today. But let's start with the softball questions. Who is MyEmpire and what do you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me, mate. MyEmpire is a cybersecurity consultancy. At the end of the day, we primarily started out as a virtual CISO focused business, but over time, naturally, it has expanded, and we now do a lot of work around governance, risk and compliance, vendor solutions, technology solutions, a little bit of, say, managed information security services. It's not quite SOC and SIEM, but very much supporting with some of those deployments that are out there. But our bread and butter, our focus and our strength is very much on security management. Security program management.
So you've mentioned a bunch of acronyms that many people are just going to go blank, blank, blank. Let's start with the interesting one. So you mentioned virtual CISO. So what does that stand for, and what does that role normally do for a business?
So virtual CISO are related to virtual CFO. So it's the chief. In this case, it's the virtual Chief Information Security Officer. We identified a while back that most organisations don't have the ability to capability or the resources to be able to build out a full security function. If you look at all of the different aspects of cybersecurity and what you need in a team to really have a holistic program, it's hard to get that one person that has all of those skills, and it's very hard to get the whole team because it's obviously not that cheap. So we expanded the concept of virtual CISO, or Chief Information Security Officer, to Security Team as a Service, which is essentially taking the broader team within the MyEmpire group under a retainer or an outcomes-based approach, and then giving companies access to the full suite of capabilities within the team. So within our team, we've got security engineers, we've got governance, risk and compliance specialists, data privacy specialists, analysts, and so on. So it's a broad team, and you have that ability to tap into all of that under that single engagement.
Okay. And whereabouts do you currently, whereabouts are you based, and in what markets do you serve or work?
So we have operations in Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne. We serve clients nationally. We have a small operation also in the UK, starting to serve sort of UK, throughout UK, but our primary operations are across Australia. In terms of industries, I get asked this one all the time. I can't answer it. It's really hard. We have a strength within APRA regulated entities because that's such a focal area at the moment for APRA with CPS 234. But we work across large and small, public and private sector, every single city and state within the country. Essentially anybody that has, any organisation that has a reliance on technology, a reliance on data.
Yeah.
It's pretty much every organisation these days.
Okay. And in terms of how long MyEmpire's been operated, how long have you been around, and then how did you get started?
So MyEmpire, the operations of MyEmpire with the services we provide have been going for about 3 to 4 years now. Yep. We did start out, as I said, as a virtual CISO organisation, so it was just, I guess, a bit of a vehicle for contracting, and I started out providing virtual CISO services into a large public company in Australia based in Melbourne. So I say in its current form, it's been operating for about 3 to 4 years now, and the team's grown quite rapidly in that period of time. But in terms of where did we start and how did it evolve to this, that's a longer story. A longer story. The abridged version is we had when I say we, my brother and I were the founders and owners of a company called Distribute IT, which we set up back in 2002, and that was a domain name and web hosting company, which had quite a sizable market share. We had 250,000 or so clients.
250,000 clients.
So we had one of the largest databases of domain registrations. We were a domain registrar, so we had, I think it was about closing in on 10%. We were registering quite aggressively month to month as well. So it was a high growth, low margin business. We had operations in Australia and in Indonesia. We had a software development team in Jakarta. And that got hit by a cyber attack in June of 2011. So we've been growing this for about 9 years.
So June 2011, You say you got hit by a cyber attack. What type of cyber attack? What happened? Let's take us back to June 2011. And
Thanks.
I know you don't want to like relive that experience, but just take us back to what happened. Like, what was that day like for you?
It goes back a week earlier than that because we actually had an incident on the Friday night the week prior. So June 11 was a Saturday, and the Friday the week prior, I think was that the third or so, we had what we thought was somebody in our network. So we took an action to kick them out, and about a week later they've come back on a Saturday evening at the right time when we didn't have our L3 support team in. We just had basic support on. It was Saturday night, just basic support at that stage. Somebody got into our network and started destroying hard drives.
So when you say destroying hard drives, remotely wiping them?
Just remotely wiping all of the data.
All your data, all your clients' information?
All of our hard drives across virtual machines across our network.
Wow.
And they had about 30 minutes to do that damage. They started by defacing our website. So they started there, and then they systematically went about destroying hard drives on servers, and they had a pretty good knowledge of what servers had the most data.
Yep.
They're obviously easy to find that information out when you've got the level of access that they did, and then started destroying the data on there. So they had about 30 minutes in the network. We kicked them out by basically ripping all the cables out of all the servers in our data centers, and then spent the next 10 or 11 or 12 days working through trying to restore services and salvage the business, basically. But over the course of that week and a half or so, a number of things went wrong we just hadn't prepared for, and they kind of created this whirlpool effect between staff management, media management, dealing with regulators, dealing with federal police investigation, dealing with customers and abusive customers and threats in the middle of the night, lack of sleep and exhaustion, lack of access to resources, staff loss. There's so many things that just piled upon themselves. And one of the key things is we focused our energies up front on the wrong things. And we focused on 4 web servers because they were the first hit and the worst hit. And as a result of that, we hadn't focused on our core revenue generating services, which we knew we could restore with some time. So business continuity planning versus disaster recovery, cart before the horse, chicken and egg, whichever saying you want to come up with here. But essentially, we just ran out of time. So as a result of that, we had to fire sale the assets. We got 2 hours warning from the governing body to say we're going to scatter your client base in 2 hours' time.
So for those who don't know, domains are regulated.
Yes.
So there's a governing body for domains, which you were obviously subject to. And so they came to you and said, due to this cyber attack, not being able to function and serve customers, we're going to take your business off you, essentially. Is that right?
Yeah, essentially it was, we're going to enact our contingency plan because you're not providing the services that you're accredited for right now. And if you can't get those services up and running in 2 hours' time, we're going to enact our contingency plan. And their contingency plan was to send an email to every single domain name owner that we were looking after, and essentially give them a one-click selection of which of our competitors to move the data to, move the domains to. So in essence, they were scattering our client base to our competitors. There were a number of other business-related factors behind that as well that were going to cause some further issues. We had a very strong reseller channel. We had about 3,500 resellers. They were going to scatter the client base of those resellers as well, in effect. And the registry, the central registry for domains, didn't actually maintain that information at that stage. We had it in our systems. So there would have been quite a number of potential longer-term impacts, and whether it was litigious or not, I don't know. But there was all those sort of considerations at that stage. So we jumped on the phone to a couple of our competitors, and there was only really one that was in a position to do the deal, and quickly. And we did the deal literally in a 5-minute phone call at 3:30 on I think it was a Tuesday afternoon. By 10 a.m. the next morning, we'd signed an asset sale agreement. So we'd basically given given them the database and the assets. They'd flown 2 people in from Sydney to hand over the keys and take over the recovery. That action brought a reprieve from the governing bodies and the government, because the government had actually stepped in at this stage as well. So that action brought a reprieve for a couple of weeks, and that allowed the continuity or continuation of the recovery efforts by the new acquirer. But essentially, we were out of business. So that was I say that's the abridged version. As you know, I talk a lot about this, and I get up and do a presentation, and so by the end of it, the mouths are, the jaws are at the floor, and everyone's, I've had tears in the room and everything. So it's quite a harrowing story, but that's where we started. And
that was the nucleus for the MyEmpire group, that experience, and creating an opportunity for the opposite of that.
Yeah, essentially, what people don't see with a cyber incident is we see what's in the press and the anger and the bitterness and the blame that's shifted towards the victims essentially. What we don't see is the impacts that a cyber attack has on people, not just while it's in the press, but for the next 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 years. And I can tell you that the impacts of a major cyber incident are felt by people for a long, long time, and not just the owners and those that are financially impacted by it, but people that work on the incident as well. We had people in the team that were really badly impacted by it. They weren't owners. In a couple of cases, they weren't in what I'd say management roles. Obviously very important to our team and our structure, but they didn't have that level of responsibility. But the impacts on them long-term post that event was quite significant from what I've seen and understood. So the nucleus there was, after 12 months of sitting on the couch in deep depression and wondering what I'm going to do with my life, and my brother was my business partner, as I mentioned. It was, well, I'd hate to see somebody else go through this. And then you start to study a bit more about cybersecurity, and you go back to school, so to speak, and the textbooks tell you some good things and they tell you good controls, but they don't tell you what it's really like and what really happens and what you really have to think about. So the nucleus for us was being part of the solution and hopefully helping people either prepare for or be in a position that they don't have a significant event like that, essentially. We're all going to experience cyber events. That's just the nature of it, unfortunately. But if we can minimise the size and scale and impact of that, then people won't go through what we went through. And that's essentially the nucleus of it.
Thank you for sharing that. It's obviously a significant event, a significant kind of trauma for everyone involved, which people don't think about in cyber. They don't consider, as you shared it. We almost get into victim blaming in the press when someone does have a breach or an attack, and we kind of go after them. But the reality is you were just a small business. It sounds like a lot of clients, but how many staff did you have at the time?
I think there was about 30.
So you had 30 staff. You weren't an Optus, you weren't a Medibank. You're a 30-person business who's experiencing a debilitating, business-ending kind of cyber attack.
Yep.
You had government involved. You have all the big entities, federal police, but people don't think that would happen to a small business.
Yeah.
Where does that belief, like it's not going to happen to me, I'm too small, come from?
I have absolutely no idea. It's probably, well, I shouldn't say that, because the reality is a lot of people don't obviously have the understanding of technology, that deep technical knowledge. So they look at it purely from a branding perspective and a visibility perspective in traditional sense. But any organisation that has anything internet facing is visible. And I think that's that lack of understanding people don't realise. So there's a number of different ways that we could be targeted, or we could just be the victim of a random attack. And in our case, it was, from my understanding, a random attack.
So this was random. This wasn't deliberate. It wasn't.
It was somebody
targeted?
Yeah, it was somebody testing, teaching themselves how to hack, and they'd taken an exploit kit from the internet. They'd scanned a whole bunch of IP ranges to see, what they could do. They'd infiltrated about 800 companies. The reason we believe that they went after us is because we took an action in that first week when we had that first incident. So a week before the major incident, we had what what we'll call a brute force attack. So it looked like somebody was trying to log into a server in our network that nobody should know existed. It was inside our network. It wasn't even internet facing. But that meant somebody was inside our network. So there was that knee-jerk reaction to kick them out. At that point, we've alerted them to the fact that we knew. So whether the destructive attack a week later was malicious to prove a point or whether it was in panic to hide tracks, who knows? But the reality was, from our understanding of the information we got at the time, was we weren't targeted because of it was an ex-employee or a hacktivist or somebody disgruntled with our business. It looks to be that we were one of many hundreds of companies that had a similar vulnerability that got exploited, but then we took an action that triggered a reaction.
And so if you were to look back on there, one of the unique scenarios, not only that you went through that, was you were actually a technology company yourself. So you're in the business of technology, you were selling domains or like www.mybusiness.com, you were selling those kind of services to other companies, but you weren't not a tech savvy business. You had technology in place, you had backups in place. How did they help you during this scenario?
There's a number of angles to this. The common misconception is there was no backups. There were backups. The challenge was the type of backups and the nature of backups and where the backups were. So they helped us to a degree in that we were able to find, I say cookie crumbs in some cases, and we were able to pull together and reconcile data from various sources and various backups, but that's time consuming. So, there's always better ways of doing it. There's always more layers, but you have to also consider the commercial constraints within the type of service that we were providing and the level of services that people were subscribing to. So there's a number of different angles to that, and that's not sort of trying to defend any position there, but the reality is, again, there's when you read media, and so when I see breaches like Optus and Medibank and Latitude and all the others, a pinch of salt, what I read. Unless it's coming, and even obviously the big corporates will manage the messaging quite well, but when you're reading articles that are out there and taking into account feedback from disgruntled employees or customers or stakeholders, generally a large portion of that is not quite correct or accurate. So in terms of what we had in place, we would have been able to restore all of our services bar probably 4 servers, which were those 4 hosting servers, from backups. What we lacked was time and money and resources. And as time went on, people diminished because of exhaustion, and we didn't have the ability to call the right expertise in to help continue that recovery that had knowledge of our information and knowledge of our systems. And there was a lack of documentation, I guess, and road mapping or architectural diagrams and designs that would give someone with those skills the ability to pick it up pretty quickly. So again, we could have restored things, but we lacked time, money, and resources.
And do you feel that's a useful lesson from your experience now that you've taken into what you do in MyEmpire and consulting, especially as it relates to backup and disaster recovery or business continuity, where businesses go to you, oh, we've got a backup, and it's kind of like a safety blanket. What do you say for those businesses who answer the question, well, we've got a backup, we're safe?
Again, a couple of angles to this one. What are you backing up? Have you backed up everything? How regularly are you backing up? Have you tested those backups? Are they encrypted? Who has access to them? Are they offsite? Have you got 3 layers? So it's not just a case of, yep, we're pushing backups for 365 over here. We've got a lot of data in a lot of systems in a lot of places now. Do we actually know what we're backing up? Do we know what we need to back up? So from a business continuity perspective, and I think that was one of the big lessons for us, is we thought it was purely a disaster recovery, IT recovery situation. All of the things that went wrong for us related more to business continuity management and how that related or aligned with disaster recovery.
Could you unpack that for people that don't know, that are kind of new to that area and thinking, well, I'm talking to my provider or my internal person and I just know backup. What are the differences between those different functions? How would you describe them?
The easiest way I can describe it, and this is a very general and loose description, but the biggest challenge you may find when you're in a situation where your technology is wiped out or unavailable is when you're in a cyber incident and there's potential that it could go to court, you might need forensics. You might need that investigation to actually unpack what's happened and how and whether there's any backdoors. So there's a delay mechanism in some respects there in terms of speed to recovery. But on the flip side, your business continuity plans say you need to be back up and running in 2 hours. Which one takes precedence? In our case, and the other thing with BCP is what needs to come back up. What do we need to restore and within what period of time? In our case, we focused on, I said, the squeaky wheel, or the noisiest ones first, which was 4,000 clients with websites hosted on 4 servers can scream pretty loudly when their own businesses are offline. So we focused on that and getting those services up when we knew they were so badly damaged. We were very worried about it. Whereas under a BCP-focused response, we would have looked at it and said, that's a problem and we need to manage that and we need to put the resources into that. But we need to get our domain systems up because that's 70% of our revenue. And we need to focus on those services which were restorable, but there was some data damage. So and there's a lot of data in there given the registry, the nature of that service. So focusing just on the noisy or the thing you're most worried about versus understanding what's important to my business. What do I need to get up and running so my business can continue to operate, even if it is in a bare bones scenario. So the difference really is the priority between what's restorable or what am I most worried about from a technology perspective versus what do I actually need to get back up and running and quickly. And then the overlay is what can't I get back up and running because I need forensics, I need legal investigation or law enforcement involvement, and so I need to leave it down or leave it offline. So all of those factors need to be considered.
If you were to fast forward to today, your very, very unique angle and experience that's lived personally creates this huge bar benchmark where you've actually gone through this experience now. So when you're talking to businesses, when you're walking into new organizations you're consulting with, being called in to audit, assess, review, how many of those, and let's focus on small and medium businesses for the moment. I know you look after ASX listed, large stock exchange listed businesses, but if we just focused on small and medium businesses, how many of those small and medium businesses that you come across have a tested, accurate, ready to go business continuity plan in place?
No, not many.
Give me a ballpark. Out of 100%, what do you think?
It probably goes up in scale. The bigger the business, the more likely they are to have something in place. The smaller businesses may have a very bare bones BCP, but the larger businesses will often have something in place. But at the smaller end of town, anything from sort of mid to small, I'd say if 5% had a really good, usable, accurate BCP that would do the job, I'd be probably about right. Wow. Maybe 5 to 10%. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh.
No, look, our experience is very similar. We don't see many organisations who are thinking about the differences between, business continuity planning and backup and disaster recovery and their interplay. And so 5% feels about right. We yet to see many organisations that have that level of preparedness in place. And so if we were just to think about those organisations and as you work with them, a lot of those organisations are on a journey. They're hearing about cybersecurity. They know it's important. The first kind of conversation they have is, it's all too hard. It's too complex. I don't understand it. It's too much money. No one's going to stop getting hacked anyway because you've got these big foreign countries involved. What's your advice to these people who are feeling overwhelmed with cybersecurity?
Well, this is the issue, isn't it? it goes back to the squeaky wheel. We see everything in the press every day around ransomware attacks and malware and people being held to ransom. So we focus on what the noisy parts, and the noise at the moment is around cyber incident response. So we go straight to that and we start to build a cyber incident response plan. And in a lot of cases, it's, well, I've got a managed service provider, it's their problem. That's one of the big observations that we do see, forgetting that the MSP only has limited visibility of the whole business and the tech stack. They've obviously got a good visibility, but there's a lot of things that they don't see or know about the business, so they couldn't help with the response. So we go straight to, I say compliance mode, but the big issue there is we go straight into, I need an incident response plan, let me get a template. And that's where that 5 to 10% comes in, because 5 to 10% of small businesses probably have a template response plan. They've filled in the blanks or done a find and replace. And they say, I've got an incident response plan.
They've ticked the box.
They've ticked the box. Haven't considered business, the business context. They haven't considered business continuity. So in the end, they've got a piece of paper, but there's not a lot of value in it, because unless it's really tested and customised, it's probably not going to be much help in the heat of the battle. That's one of the biggest issues we see, and that's so when we walk into organisations, the first thing we'll say is almost pause, take a breath, and think about what's actually important. What have you got, first of all? And the starting point for us is often to go in there and say, let's just map out what we have and where we have it, who has access to it. Let's just understand our business a little bit more, because at that point, once you start unpacking that, you can start to think about what can go wrong. And then you start to think about, well, if that goes wrong, how will I respond to it? And then suddenly you've got an informed position. And even if that piece of paper that is that informed position is a page long, it's more effective than a 50-page template that you've downloaded. So a lot of what we say to people when we start is just, let's just understand. Let's just get context right, scope and context. I talk about scope and context all the time. If we understand scope and context, we're in a much better position to make more logical and informed judgments in terms of our policies and our response plans.
And so talking about policies, obviously a lot of people hear about the government's Essential 8 recommendations in terms of protecting their businesses. There's the International Standards Organisation, the ISO 27001 cybersecurity framework. The US government has the NIST, National Institute of Science and Technology.
That's the one.
And so they have a framework as well when it comes to cybersecurity. So there's a wealth of these frameworks around. How does a business choose a framework? Is this whack-a-mole? Is this eeny, meeny, miny, mo? How does a small business choose the right framework?
You've got, and it goes further than that, because if you've got APRA.
For those who don't know, who's APRA?
So APRA is essentially the regulator for financial institutions. So they've got CPS 234, which is another standard that banks and APRA regulated entities need to comply with. In the UK and Europe, they're bringing out DORA, which is a similar one, which is for, again, financial industry, which is coming into effect, I think, in early next year.
You have the Privacy Act locally.
You've got the Privacy Act. If you're transacting credit cards, you've got PCI DSS. There are, as you said, a number of frameworks. Starting point comes back to scope and context. I'm sorry to say.
I'm guessing this is going to be a trend. Scope and context.
Yeah, you might hear this a bit, sorry.
That's okay, that's good. So help us understand, how does scope and context apply to choosing a cybersecurity framework?
So if you understand what industry you're in, what are the regulatory requirements, that will drive some of that decision making. Or if you're in an industry where you're servicing customers or have stakeholders that are in an industry that have specific requirements, that will guide those requirements, that framework decision. If you're transacting credit cards, PCI DSS will obviously come into play in some way. If you fall outside of all of those things, it might be, if you're an Australian company that's dealing with ASX listed companies and you're seeing a lot of questionnaires coming in, and most of them are asking for certification. Well, you're probably going to go down the ISO 27001 path because that's something you can certify to. If you're dealing with Australian federal government or state government, you might be forced down the Essential 8 path initially. The reality is, over time, you'll probably want to align to more than one because they're all different. E8, Essential 8 and ISO are very, very different standards. There's not a lot of overlap between them in many ways. One's very narrow, focused on technical controls largely. One is more of the governance-related controls. So your starting point for frameworks will be driven by the type of business, the industry you're in, and that stakeholder direction that's being provided. And if you have none of those things, then it's probably then a question of, are you more worried about compliance or you're more worried about risk?
So unpack that. What do you mean the difference between compliance and risk?
So if you just want to tick a box, then you might go for, I say an easier standard, but you might go for something that's a bit narrower, that's more relevant to your business. If you are more worried about putting in place a risk-focused approach where you're not just ticking a box, you really want to manage this risk and you really don't want to be a victim of a cyber event, then you might go down a broader framework like ISO 27001, which is risk-focused. So if the compliance piece is really driven by, I'm getting these questionnaires or I've just got to tick the box to get this certification, that's the compliance focus. The risk focus is more, I just genuinely don't want to be a victim of a major incident, and I want to focus my limited budget on the things that really matter to my business.
When you talk about budget, that's obviously a key sticking point. For anyone that's in business, and you spoke about it before at the very beginning of your own story around, you can spend a huge amount of money on these kind of projects and journeys when it comes to cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. So, obviously trying to work out, like, how do you even determine what's an appropriate spend when it comes to cybersecurity?
Yeah, we talk around return on investment a lot, don't we? With when we're spending anything, but it's often hard to quantify. You can quantify that return in terms of potential loss and so on. It's hard. The reality is it's difficult. But what organisations often do is they'll look at it and say, well, what do I need to do to solve this problem? And what I think people would probably need to recognise is it's an ongoing investment and it's an ongoing process, and I hate to say it, an ongoing journey. So it's not one that you can sort of say, this is how much I need to spend to get myself to this level. That spend will evolve over time. You'll spend today on something that manages a risk that's relevant today, but in 2 years from now, you might downgrade and see that risk has gone away or can be solved in a different way, and you can repoint that investment somewhere else. But that risk-focused approach really helps you. It's probably the best way of being able to manage that budget, because you can sit there with senior people within the business and communicate the right issues and the right focus areas, and then you can probably articulate better that return on investment that's needed to manage that risk, because you're providing that business context to them. So it's a hard one to give a definitive answer to say, well, this is how much you probably need to spend on security to manage that risk, because that risk is different to every business.
And when you spoke about a risk-based approach, you also spoke about having an ongoing spend versus a one-off spend. So cybersecurity used to be a very small part of everyone's budget. Now some people are saying, well, I'm paying my IT team or my external provider, they've got it covered. And if they do spend, it's a one-off spend. But you're saying, no, this is actually an ongoing spend that every business is now having to add to their expense list. So how do you frame that with an organisation who's struggling to justify these kind of spends? There's new spends.
Yeah, there's a misconception here that I go to my MSP, I buy a tool, I've solved that problem. But when that tool's in place, I have to maintain it. It has to be maintained, it has to be fed and watered, it has to be reviewed. The policies in there need to evolve over time as my business evolves and as the threat landscape evolves. So there's a continual management of the platform. So just subscribing to a solution and paying a 12-month subscription fee or a monthly fee for every month for years and years is one part of it. But then for that to be an effective deployment, you need someone to maintain it. So there's a spend. In a lot of cases, you need to train users. Not all these tools sit in the background and just do the job. Some of these tools are there as tools to help users reduce risk and reduce the likelihood of an event. And a good example of that is password vaults. You can't just subscribe to a password vault, give everyone a login to it, and then assume that you've solved that problem. You need to deploy it. You need to make sure it's embedded into there's the browser widget. You've got training and awareness done. You've got everyone informed on how it works, how to use it, how to securely generate passwords. You need to do audits on that to see if there's compromised passwords. A lot of those password vaults will do dark web monitoring and generate the alerts. You need somebody that will then go and do the investigation, follow up with the users and say, hey, we've got a detection here that one of your passwords may be compromised. You need to change it. You may need to change it in other places if you've reused it. It's not a set and forget. So as you deploy a new solution, you need to realise that there's the whole people, process and technology triad. There's people requirements, there's process requirements, and there's obviously technology requirements. You need someone to manage it, you need someone to train, you need documentation updates. Your policy may need to be updated, your procedures may need to be updated, your onboarding, offboarding processes. And then every year you need to review those things. So the effort incrementally increases as well as the investment incrementally increases as you add more security controls within your business.
And so if you were looking at, you spoke before about internal teams or managed service providers, MSPs. A lot of people have an MSP in place, but you've also spoken about how do you audit your IT function when it comes to security? Who's checking the checkers?
We're seeing a bit of a trend that the MSPs are trying to be the student and teacher, unfortunately. We're seeing a big trend where MSPs are trying to offer that, or offering that governance, risk and compliance piece. We see it a lot overseas in the UK with Cyber Essentials, actually. That's really interesting, where the MSPs are certification bodies for Cyber Essentials, so they'll tick their own homework and then they'll provide a certificate to their client for a few extra £100 and say, there you go, there's your Cyber Essentials for the year. So you really do need to split that piece out independently, just to get that level of independence and another set of eyes on it. And again, MSPs, they're so crucial to the delivery of the security function for a business, but their focus and their scope will be narrowed to whatever they're told and whatever they're given. And I think proper GRC and proper audit, proper oversight takes a much more holistic business view and separates away from the actual delivery function. If you look at, the easiest way to look at it is if you look at large enterprises, the security function will sometimes often sit under the CIO, but there'll be a separate function. They don't sit underneath IT normally. So they'll sit either as a peer or as a separate function. For that reason, that the IT team and the IT function needs to deliver the services, but someone needs to oversee. So when you've engaged an MSP to deliver those services, you really need to look outside of that just for the oversight. So
that's a big gap. You have MSPs or IT teams offering cybersecurity, offering services, but if they're not working with a governance, risk and compliance organisation, if they don't have someone coming in and assessing how that's working in the client, who's finding weaknesses or vulnerabilities in that supply chain? Like, is the customer exposed in that scenario potentially?
Potentially, yeah. We obviously see both sides. We've worked with both, and every business we go into has gaps. That's the reality. So it's a hard one to answer without sounding like I'm throwing people under the bus, unfortunately.
But do you feel, Matt, perhaps that's linked back to the maturity of the industry? If we look at cybersecurity, 5 years ago, very few MSPs were taking cybersecurity seriously. As a country in Australia, we were not taking cybersecurity seriously. Do you think those two are related?
There's definitely a maturity piece, but part of that challenge, I think, is the uncertainty because there's so many different players, all vying for, I say, attention in terms of. We spoke about governance frameworks. Even in government, you've got the National Cybersecurity Coordinator, you've got the ACSC, the NCSC, you've got Home Affairs obviously have oversight there. We've got frameworks at government level, at industry level. There's confusion, and as a result, that's naturally always going to, I think, keep maturity down because there's no clear or no clarity exactly on what are the requirements and how. So the maturity is certainly improving, but I think while we've got such a confused environment, it will always be in some way imperfect.
So let's zoom out for a moment. We're talking about like government, we're talking about the industry. So what are the top 3 trends you see impacting the cybersecurity industry at the moment here in Australia?
AI is obviously a big one that everyone's talking about, and that's, I'm not an expert in that, so I'm not going to speak too deeply on that one. But I guess AI we're seeing a lot of in terms of vendors talking up the use of AI and their ability to detect and respond faster to incidents and automate some of the response. So there's a big push in that regard. But then on the flip side, what does AI mean in terms of a threat? And that could be, through loss of data pollution, all of those sort of issues that we're starting to hear about, and then the use of AI by the attackers to get smarter and more effective. So it's a continual battle, isn't it? New technology comes in and it's used for good and bad, and AI is going to be no different. So that's definitely one of the big ones. Cloud is always has been there for a while now, but that's a continual issue because, and this comes back to some of that conversation around managed service providers. The amount of times that we speak to clients and we say, do you know all of the applications you have? And the exercise to map all of the web applications that they've subscribed to and they've put their data into, potentially connected up through APIs, to share data between different applications. That is a significant trend and a significant issue in my books because we've just lost all visibility of where our data is. In the past, in some ways, having a couple of servers on premise in the hallway cupboard is, in some respects, a little bit better than...
It was more secure.
Yeah, in some ways, than this proliferation of our data going everywhere around the world, and we have no idea. And in many cases, we don't have the governance in place to actually understand the security controls that those providers have put in place to protect our data. And I guess the other trend that we're seeing is I think there is definitely a growing acceptance that we need to be prepared to respond. So we are seeing a shift or people putting in place something to, or moving towards putting in place something to respond to in terms of an incident response plan. But the other trend, if I tie that back to the other issue or trend that I'm seeing, is the cookie cutter and compliance approach. So with a boom market, and cyber is a massive risk, but the reality is that becomes a boom market. It's no different to Y2K, no different to the growth in web services in the early 2000s as well. We're in a
So the gold rush time.
It's gold rush time, right? It's gold rush time.
That's an interesting angle.
So quality comes down.
So let's talk about that. So what are the implications of being in a gold rush when it comes to cybersecurity?
Reduction of quality, less clarity on legitimate players and providers, experienced providers, confusion in the market around what I actually need, because there's a lot of people selling a lot of stuff. And there's a guy in the US who, Richard Steinen, I think is his name, he does a book called The Security Yearbook. And he has been tracking for some years now all of the security vendors and managed service providers in around the world. He's got some criteria. We tried to get ourselves on there and he said no because we're just a GRC company. But this book is hundreds of pages long, and it contained, I think the last one I looked at was 3,000 or 4,000 security solutions. Just in the GRC space, in terms of technology solutions, there was over 600 web applications or security solution providers providing security solutions or solutions for managing the governance, risk and compliance component of your security program. So in a gold rush comes a lot of choice. It comes obviously some price considerations, but I think also comes confusion, which can have a negative impact on maturity, to that earlier point.
We've seen a lot of talk about the shortages in cybersecurity because of this gold rush. So in finding the right resources, the right skilled resources at the right price, and having security resources internally has become unattainable for many businesses because their prices are just too large, and so they're all going to work for large corporates, large enterprises. How do you see that playing out? Do you see that trend continuing? Is there anything that can be done as it relates to shortages of cybersecurity professionals?
It depends what you're looking for in terms of cybersecurity professionals. I understand there's an argument both ways around this skills shortage. There's no skills shortage. You get the right people with the right qualities, and they can be trained up on that role that they need to fill within a cybersecurity context. And I said earlier that to have a security function, you need a range of different skills. So I think this concept of this skill shortage is we're lacking people that have the whole knowledge, and there's not many of those around, if any. So I disagree to a large extent that we have such a big skills shortage. What we do have is a massive demand, but people are over expecting in terms of what everyone's going to bring. You know, you want a security engineer, but you want them to be a GRC expert. You want a security analyst, but you want them to be able to write security. You want them to analyse the alerts coming out of the monitoring tools, but you want them to be able to do a risk assessment at the same time. Very, very different skill sets. So I think there's massive demand. I think as organisations are getting wiser and they're being a bit more specific in terms of what they need to fill their security requirements, I think it will improve. Personally, I'm ever the optimist, I guess.
Do you think this is related to what you saw as an opportunity? Is people don't need a security person; they need a security team.
Correct.
And that's the mistake that businesses are making, is they're thinking, actually, we just need a security person. But the reality is most, if not all, organisations need a security team because it's not one profession, it's not one individual that can cover all the bases when it comes to security.
I learnt this myself really quickly. I took on a role leading a security function in a large organisation, and I realised, I probably knew before I went in there, but it was really evident early on, there were so many different angles and requirements that we needed to fulfil. I wasn't a specialist in those areas. I understood the governance, risk and compliance piece, but I wasn't necessarily a specialist in the compliance framework that was applicable at that stage. So it very much comes down to right person, right seat. And for the MSPs out there, they're more looking at EOS. I think I've just hit a keyword for you.
Yeah.
You need the right capability and the right skill set for the specific function that you're trying to fill. So and understanding what that function is that you're trying to fill will help you find the right person much quicker. If you just say, I need a security person, you're probably going to be disappointed because you're going to find very quickly that they've got very specific limits to where their expertise starts and finishes. We see it a lot with managed service providers. I don't want to beat up managed service providers, but we see it a lot here that with the governance, risk and compliance component, I've seen it so many times where they say we do virtual CISO now. Who's your virtual CISO that you send out there? It's our lead engineer. Right? Technically brilliant, understands security controls, understands technology, understands technical landscapes, but then pivoting them to be able to talk risk and have those risk conversations is really hard. So we see that quite a lot.
And so if that's a big mistake because people are trusting this person to look after them. So if we stay on that and think, well, you're seeing a lot of organisations. What do you think the top 3 mistakes are for organisations when it comes to cybersecurity that you regularly come across?
Yeah. There's a few. I personally think the most common one that is the biggest issue is lack of visibility, and it's twofold. One is there's an assumption that the MSP is dealing with it or knows and has it all. But secondly, it's just not understanding what hardware, software, web applications, IP, legal and regulatory requirements I have. Right? It's visibility. And it goes back, scope and context. Yeah. Having really clear view of what systems I have, the people I have, who has what access, what I've subscribed to, where my data goes, how it connects, how it flows, the data flows as well. That's not a small piece of work to undertake, particularly for a well-established business. But it makes the discussions and the decision-making a whole lot easier down the track because you really know what your priorities are. So probably the biggest one I think I see 100% of the time is incomplete or just a lack of understanding of what we've got and where it is. There's a general understanding. We use Microsoft, so it must be all in there. But then it sort of drops away from there. Technology focus is the next one. And again, this probably comes back to I've just thrown it over the fence to my IT guys to sort out. So we see, we've got security okay because we've got anti-malware on our machines and, we've got MFA in place. Again, is it in place everywhere? Well, we don't know because we haven't got visibility. So I think that technical security focus is a bit of an issue for most organisations because it's, again, going back to my incident, it's assumed to be a technology problem only. So we focus on the technical controls. And don't get me wrong, they're super important, obviously. We need those tools and we need layers of tools. But we also need to be able to manage those tools well. So just focusing on buying tools and putting them in and then not thinking about how they're going to work, how we're going to manage them, how we're going to keep them fed and watered, as I said earlier, that's a really big challenge. And then I said it's a trend that we're seeing evolving, so which is a positive. But the other one is just lack of preparedness. That one I'd call out as a big one. But we are getting a lot of calls and we're having a lot of conversations with organisations that want to put a plan in place and want to test that plan. But lack of preparedness, can be I've got a plan but I've never tested it. So when you actually get in the heat of the battle, it means nothing. It doesn't actually help you at all. So they're probably the big 3 for me.
I think there was a famous quote from, I can't remember if it was an FBI or CIA director who said, it's not if, but when you become a victim of cybersecurity incident of some type or an attack. Do you subscribe to that for businesses nowadays?
To a degree. It depends on, you're always going to have incidents. It's how big and bad they are. And the more you plan and prepare and put some of these controls in place, the more likely you are that you'll have an incident, but it can be dealt with in normal operations, and it won't be as bad as it could have been if you hadn't been prepared. But that said, you could be the victim of an incident that's out of your control, but it's your data. So supply chain, you have your data out in the wild web, and you get alerted that there's been a compromise, and all your clients' data has been subsequently compromised during an incident response mode, and in some ways that's out of your control. So I subscribe to it, but I don't subscribe to it. Well, I subscribe to it on the basis that you'll probably be involved or be a victim of, in some capacity, a cyber incident. But a really bad one, no, I think you can manage. I think you can put things in place to actually prevent the bad stuff, the really bad stuff from happening.
And if we were talking about that, if you're in a room filled with managing directors, CEOs, business owners, if there was one bit of advice that you could give them about cybersecurity, and I know that's the kind of the $1,000,000 question. But if you were standing in front of them, you've had this lived experience. What one piece of advice would you give them?
Lead the conversation. A lot of CEOs, managing directors, they are worried about it, but they say, I don't understand it. So they get security people in, they'll get their IT guys in, and they'll say, solve the problem. Be part of the conversation and lead it. Right? You don't have to be the specialist, but you can be there and start to learn from it, but also provide the business context. And if you're providing that leadership and business context, you'll find that decisions that the subject matter experts are making are going to be much better informed and much more effective. And you're going to also understand and be able to feed back the business implications of those decisions and help guide the execution of them. So it could be a new piece of technology that has implications on how users operate within the business and changes in behaviour that need to happen. By being there and being part of that conversation and driving it, you can feed back what is and isn't possible, but you can also help with that people and process piece to actually make a more effective outcome. So my one piece of advice, and I've actually presented on this one, funny enough, and I said the one piece of advice I gave them was lead the conversation. Don't delegate it.
Lead it. And if we were thinking about, we've spoken a lot about choosing the right partner, frameworks, all the different decisions that need to be made. The one thing we haven't spoken about is how do you choose a good cybersecurity governance, risk and compliance firm? Like you spoke about the confusion, there's so many choices around. If someone could choose an organisation, and let's not obviously focus on the deliberate question, which would be obviously choose MyEmpire Group, but let's focus on, so what would be the things that a business would look for in a cybersecurity governance, risk, compliance firm?
Yeah, I think experience is obviously one, and the people. It's very much in our space. It's a consulting piece, so it has to come down to the experience and the quality of the individuals. So not necessarily the size of the team, but the quality of the individuals and the experience that they can demonstrate and their understanding of your business. It's not just a tick box consulting exercise that good ones will do, where they come in, they go, here's a report, template report. It's, have we understood your business? Do we understand you, your business, your outcomes, your objectives, your strategy, and how they relate to security and the activities that you're asking us to investigate or help you with here. So being able to get a feel for the consultancy, that really understanding your business and outcomes and the strategy and how this relates then to security, rather than scare you with horror stories of Medibank and Optus and Latitude, or throw governance frameworks down your throat straight away to say you need to comply, or best practice without considering scope and context again. They're the red flags. When I was on the other side of the fence and I had consultants coming in to try and sell to me, they were red flags. If they sat down and actually understood my business, they'd done their research, they'd asked the right questions, and they were able to clearly articulate the value prop that they were going to provide and the outcomes that it was going to provide in relation to where I'm trying to go, and even give me a bit of free advice on the way through. They were the good ones for mine, versus you need to do ISO 27001, here's a proposal.
And again, let's maybe switch that around. What advice would you give to your fellow cybersecurity professionals? So, if we've got the audience of managing directors, if there's something you would like to see, and maybe it's maturity, maybe it's thinking, maybe it's approach, but what is something you think the cybersecurity professionals need to embrace?
I think we still have a tendency to victim shame. As soon as there's another breach, you know that, and I've done it today, right? I've called out the 3 big breaches we've had in the last year or so. As soon as there's an incident, everyone in security just starts talking about it. There was one last week in New South Wales with the clubs. Right? Guaranteed that all the clubs around the country are getting called right now, and that particular victim, that organisation's being rolled out as the scapegoat or as the example of why they should engage. So I think if we can better manage how we use examples of what can go wrong and how it can go wrong rather than victim shaming, it's not an easy one to do, but that's probably the big one for me.
Alex from MyEmpire Group, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Lon. Cheers, mate.